Welcome to another Bio 151 lecture. Just a reminder that your sapling homework for Chapter 43 is due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. and office hours are via Zoom on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3. So now we're transitioning from talking about anatomy and physiology of animals to talking about ecology. And so this is our first lecture on ecology, and today it's going to be focused on behavioral ecology. So here's a great example of behavioral ecology. Fireflies, and if you're not from the East Coast, you haven't seen these, fireflies have bioluminescence in their hind part of their abdomen. And the males perform mating dances to find mates. And so what this picture is here are various patterns of mating dances that males of different species of fireflies do. The females of the genus Protorus lure in males of a different genus of firefly by replying to their courtship dances. So they're tricking the males to come thinking that they're going to mate with a female. But the female has a deceitful plan. Once the male comes in, the female of this other species will actually capture him and eat him. The reason that she's doing this is because she cannot make a defensive chemical that he can. And so by eating him, she can get this defensive chemical, which will protect her from being eaten by predators such as spiders. So this increases her fitness because she's less likely to be eaten before she's able to mate. After she eats this male, she will then respond to males of her own species. So that's an example of two different types of behavior. We have a mating dance, and then we also have the tricking of a different organism. So here's other examples of different behaviors that animals do to survive and increase their fitness. In this first picture, we have this is a group of sawflies, and the male right here who's mating with the female has to bring her what's called a nuptial gift. So he brings her basically a snack. If she accepts, he's able to mate with her. If the nuptial gift is too small, in some species, the female, if she finishes eating her gift before the male's done mating, she'll then eat the male as well. This is a picture of a rough-skinned newt, and sometimes when they feel threatened, they'll assume this defensive posture called unker flexing. And they arch their backs and their tails, and they raise up their heads to expose a brightly colored underside, which signals that they are poisonous to eat. So it's a way to defend themselves against potential predators. Down here, male bowerbirds make nests adorned with brightly colored fruits and flowers to attract mates. So the females will go to the nest and inspect it to see if it's bright enough and beautiful enough to mate with that male. And many primates, including gorillas, groom each other to remove ectoparasites. So that's another type of behavior. So what is a behavior? A behavior is simply a response to stimuli that influences how an animal responds to the environment. And behaviors can have to do with feeding, mating, avoiding predators, etc. So in this picture down here, we have two male cheetahs that are marking their territory by urinating on a tree. So they're using a scent behavior, an olfactory behavior, to warn other cheetahs that this is their territory and to stay out. Behaviors like this have evolved to maximize growth, survivorship, and reproduction, and to minimize death. Maximizing reproduction is very important because that maximizes fitness. And remember, we learned about fitness when we talked about evolution earlier this semester. And fitness is the number of surviving descendants produced by an individual. It's the measure to the extent to which an individual's genotype is represented in the next generation. So natural selection shapes behavior. If a behavior is allowing an individual to survive and reproduce, that behavior, if it's genetic, will be passed on genetically, or the behavior can be learned by the offspring and passed on that way. So we're going to watch a video about an interesting behavior in shoebill birds. As you watch this video, think about why this particular behavior in these organisms would have evolved.
A giant, prehistoric-looking bird. A shoebill. Standing well over a meter tall, she roams these swamps, trying to catch catfish. Not exactly what she was after. Deeper into the swamp lies the reason for all this fishing. This chick is just 3 weeks old and a little bit wobbly on its feet. Its vast bill means it has trouble balancing. It won't be able to fly or even walk properly for several weeks. It's entirely reliant on its parents for food and water. There is also a smaller chick who isn't doing so well. The larger chick pesters its mother for a drink. While she goes off to fetch water, it reveals a dark side to the relationship with its nest mate. It's 3 days older than the other chick and has always won the race for food and attention. This is more than just a scrap between two siblings. As their mother returns, she sees what the larger chick has done. The smaller chick seeks its mother's comfort. But she has already made her choice. Only her firstborn will get a drink.
So that behavior in the shoebill might seem harsh to us, but the idea behind it is that the female lays 2 eggs. This ensures that at least one hatches. The one that hatches first is most likely to survive to adulthood because the parents give all of the food to their larger chick. By having 2 eggs, you ensure that you have one offspring that will hatch. But by prioritizing the larger chick, the parents can better assure that that one offspring will survive to adulthood and mate and pass their genes on to the next generation. So by doing this, the shoebill increase their fitness for their offspring. So we have our first question for today. Behavior is shaped by A, environmental factors, B, genetic factors, or C, both environmental and genetic factors. Okay, so if we think about the shoebill, there's both environmental and genetic factors that are at play because the older chick has to have something in its genes that give that chick the innate behavior to fight against its younger and smaller sibling. So when we're thinking about behaviors, a biologist named Tinbergen came up with 4 questions to think about why we see these behaviors in animals. And this table below is from your book. The way to think about this is the 4 areas are causation, development, adaptive function, and evolutionary history. Causation is what physiological mechanisms cause the behavior. So this can have many different answers. Is it caused by a neural, muscular, or other process? What is causing it? Then we have development. How did this behavior develop? What is the role of genes and the environment on the development of this behavior? Is it something that is just inherently in the genes of that organism? Or are there cues from the environment that might be affecting an organism from developing a certain behavior? And then adaptive function. How does the behavior promote the individual's ability to survive and reproduce? If it hinders or hurts the organism's ability to survive and reproduce, that is not an adaptive trait and it will not be passed on to the next generation most likely. And then evolutionary history. How did a behavior evolve over time? And to help us think about these 4 questions, we're going to go through the example of why does a bird sing? So if we think about causation, hormone levels changed in response to the changes in the length of the day. So because of the changes in day length, it is now that signal to the bird, I need to sing. So there's a change in hormone levels. More immediately, how does a bird sing? Air passes through its specialized singing organ, and that causes the membranes to vibrate rhythmically. So we have a larger hormonal change, but also how does that behavior actually occur in the organism? It sings through its specialized organ. Development. Male songbirds typically learn a song from their fathers. So when they're born, male songbirds have a sensitive period and then they start twittering, which is a nonsensical song. They then use time to imprint their song from their father, and then by time they're old enough to mate, so basically by the time they're a year old, they have a structured singing pattern which they use in the adaptive function, which is singing to attract a mate and reproduce. So singing to attract a mate helps to increase their fitness. And then evolutionary history. How did this songbird structured song evolve? Complex songs may have evolved from vocalizations made by ancestors, and those vocalizations were reinforced and became increasingly standardized over time. Sometimes these behaviors have originated to fulfill a function different from the one it currently serves. So for song for a particular species may have first evolved to claim territory, but now it's used to attract mates. Another example is marking territory in mammals, such as that picture of the cheetahs on a few slides ago. All animals have to excrete their waste, And so by urinating, that was already something that fulfilled a different function. But realizing that there's a particular smell associated with each individual's urine, it then evolved to mark territory as well. So it serves two purposes. There's different types of behaviors in animals. There's innate behaviors, which are behaviors that are instinctive and carried out regardless of earlier experiences. No learning is required in innate behaviors. There's preset paths in the nervous system. So this is genetic. There's fixed action patterns, and we'll talk about fixed action patterns on the next slide. So in this figure up top, we have a female silkworm that's producing pheromones at the tip of her abdomen. The male moths have very large plumed antennae, and these antennae have many hairs on them, and they pick up the pheromones in the air. Once enough of those receptors have been activated, the male flies towards the female. And this is just something he does. It's not a behavior he learned. It is imprinted in his nervous system to fly once enough of those receptors are activated. The other type of behavior are learned behaviors. And these are behaviors that changed based on an individual's experience. The experience modifies responses to stimuli. So for example, many primates, in this example, chimpanzees, watch older individuals in their group use tools to get honey out of bees' nests, and then the younger individuals mimic this behavior. So they're learning that behavior from older individuals in their group. So first we're going to talk about innate behaviors in more detail, and then we'll talk about learned behaviors. So fixed action patterns are innate behaviors. They are behaviors that consist of a sequence of behaviors that are once triggered have to be followed through to completion. For the fixed action pattern to occur, they need to have a key stimulus. So in this example, we have a goose, and the key stimulus is the egg has fallen out of the nest. When the goose sees this, it then has an innate reaction through its nervous system that causes it to roll the egg back into the nest. Even if the egg is attached to a string and it is unable to move it, the entire action, that fixed action of rolling the egg back to the nest, will continue to the end, even if the egg does not come with the goose. So you can't break it down into smaller units. The goose cannot recognize, oh, the egg isn't coming, I'm not going to continue to move my neck in this pattern. It has to go through to completion. Nervous systems must process stimuli from a response for it to be carried out. Feature detectors are specialized sensory receptors or groups of sensory receptors that respond to important signals in the environment. So an example of a behavior that requires a feature detector are in frogs. Different species of frogs have specific calls. In frogs, the combination of different feature detectors, which can include the pitch of the call, the duration of the call, and the pulse frequency of the call, stimulated by different components, add up to be recognized by the frog of a specific call. Once the sound has been correctly identified, the appropriate behavior follows. Typically in frogs, it's the males who are making the call, and they're calling to mate with a female. And so the female has to be able to pick out the specific feature detectors of her species' calls, even when many species might be calling at the same time. And she pinpoints that and then is able to find the male of her species to mate with. Hormones also affect animal behavior. Hormones are released due to certain stimuli, and they provoke a more widespread and prolonged effect compared to a feature detector. So an example is with the green anole, which is this lizard pictured up top. This is a male, and he is displaying a mating signal. In the presence of no males, only 80% of the females are prepared for reproduction. So their egg follicles and their ovaries are ready, but that's only 80% of the group. When one male is introduced to the group, 100% of the females are reproductively active. And this is because the females produce hormones when the male starts his courting behavior. When you put multiple males into the group, only 40% of the females undergo ovarian development. Because when you have more than one male, the males have to fight for dominance among themselves. Because of that, they cannot do their courting behavior, and so we don't have that key stimulus for the females that causes them to prepare their ovaries for reproduction. So without that courting display, the hormones in the females are not strong enough to prepare their ovaries for reproduction. So now we're going to talk more about learning. Learning is the process of changing behaviors based on experience. And so we're going to talk about two main different types of learning. The first is non-associative learning. Non-associative learning occurs in the absence of any particular outcome. And there's two types of non-associative learning. The first is habituation. Habituation is the reduction or elimination of a behavioral response to a repeatedly presented stimulus. So in this picture on this slide, we have crows present in a cornfield. A farmer might put out a scarecrow to scare the crows away, but prolonged exposure to the scarecrow no longer produces that stimulus of flying away. So they are now used to it. It's like a habit. They see it every day. It is no longer scary. The other type of non-associative learning is sensitization. And this is the enhancement of a response to a stimulus that is achieved by presenting a strong or novel stimulus first. So, an example of this is when you take lizards out of a city and place them in a field, they learn to make softer mating calls because they are not in such a loud place. So that's an example of sensitization. So we have non-associative learning. The other type of learning is associative learning, or also called conditioning. And this happens when animals learn to associate to events. And there's two different types of associative learning. There's classical conditioning and operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, a stimulus leads to a behavior is paired with a neutral stimulus. So this is the example of Pavlov's dog. So in a neutral stimulus, ringing a bell, the dog doesn't do anything. In our unconditioned stimulus of food, the dog salivates. During conditioning, the bell is rang every time there's food, and so the dog salivates. And then after conditioning, just ringing the bell, even in the absence of food, causes salivation because it's a conditioned stimulus now. So that's classical conditioning. In operant conditioning, if the behavior is punished or negatively reinforced, the response becomes less likely. So if we look at the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning, if the behavior happens more often, you add positive reinforcement and you add negative reinforcement. In operant conditioning, if you are thinking about children, if they do something good, they complete their chores on time, a positive reinforcement would be letting them watch their favorite TV show. and maybe you take away one of their chores the next day. So that's a positive and negative reinforcement to help that behavior occur more often. If the behavior happens less often, then you have positive punishment and negative punishment. So if they don't do their chores that day, the positive punishment would be making them do their siblings' chores tomorrow, and the negative punishment would be they don't get to watch TV that night. So the next type of learning is observational learning. And this one example is imitation. And that's when one individual copies another. So we have an association with an adult chimpanzee using a tool to get termites out of a mound, and the younger chimps are watching their mom learning that skill. So they will imitate her until they get very good at it. So this is just a flow chart for you to help organize all the different types of learning. So we have learning, and they could be divided into 3 categories: associative learning, non-associative learning, and observational learning. And these can be broken down. Associative learning is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Non-associative learning is habituation and sensitization, and observational learning is imitation. So, your next question for today. A behavioral scientist designs an experiment to examine learning in mice. Each mouse is given a small electric shock. If the mouse jumps due to the shock, it does not receive food. If it does not react to the shock, it is rewarded with food. Over time, the mice stop reacting to the shock treatment. Of which of the following types of learning is this an example of? A, classical conditioning, B, operant conditioning, C, habituation, D, sensitization, or E, imitation. So pause the video and answer the second question. So learning is not the only way that behavior is affected. Behavior can also be affected by orientation and navigation. So kinesis is a random unidirectional movement. So for example, a paramecium is in an unfavorable environment, such as water that's too warm or too salty. It will increase its speed and begins to make random turns until it finds a more favorable environment. But the paramecium does not have control over these movements. They're random. In taxis, movements are in a specific direction in response to a stimulus. So an example is insects using their relationship to the sun and Earth's magnetic field. So monarch butterflies, for example, migrate very long distances over the course of their lifetime. So they use the location and brightness and angle of the sun and the Earth's magnetic poles to navigate as they migrate. So they receive, in this example, sunlight stimulus. It goes into their eye. They have an internal compass which tells them which direction to tilt based on the location of the sun. They can change their tilt. They can change or decrease their speed. And this outcome leads to the behavior of changing their direction of flight to make sure they're navigating in the correct direction based on the timing of their migration. Biological clocks also affect behavior. There's many different types of biological clocks. The first one is the circadian clock. You probably have heard of the circadian rhythm. And this regulates many daily rhythms in animals, including feeding, sleeping, hormone production, and core body temperature. So in this figure on the right, this is a study of the circadian rhythms of melatonin, which is on the top, which is a hormone that is secreted in our bodies that tell us when to sleep or help us get sleepy. And then on the bottom, this is showing the release of cortisol over the period of 24 hours. And you can see that based on the daytime, so the daily rhythm, at night, the amount of melatonin increases and then it decreases during the day. So at night, it's being released so that hormone can tell us to have the behavior of going to sleep. And then the opposite is true of cortisol. So we decrease the amount of cortisol at night and then it increases in the morning and it tells us to wake up and go about our day. So even in our human bodies, our circadian clock is always working. It's one of the reasons why you feel jet lagged after you travel internationally. There's also lunar clocks, which are based on the moon. And these are very important for animals that live in habitats where the tides are important. So for example, corals will release their egg and their sperm into the water when the tides are at a particular level. And they coordinate that across their species. They use that lunar clock so that they ensure that their gametes are more likely to find the gametes of another individual by timing the release of them based on the lunar clock and the tides. There's also an annual clock, which is a yearly clock. And then there's seasonal clocks, which are clocks that help measure the day length or photoperiod. And this is very important for timing things such as breeding seasons and migrations. So many animals use their seasonal clock based on the photoperiod to time when they're going to breed so that their offspring are born in the spring and are growing during the summer when food resources are more abundant. Communication is another important form of behavior. And communication is simply the transfer of information between two individuals, the sender and the receiver. The sender supplies the signal, and that elicits a response from the receiver. And there's many types of communication. There's visual communication, so you can look at colors and patterns. There's olfactory, which is smell, so you can have release of pheromones or leaving pheromones behind to mark a territory. You could have tactile, which are more movement-based, so you could have courtship, breeding, parental care, tactile communication, and auditory, so that's sound, so mating calls and warning calls. So if we look down here, this is a greater prairie chicken, and you can see that it's doing a mating dance right now. So it not only has its visual cues, these big drums that poof out on its neck, but it also has tactile cues. It will dance around and stomp its feet to dance to entice females. At the same time, it also is doing an auditory communication because it's stomping its feet, making noise, and it also has a call that it makes to attract females. We have wild dogs, which work together in a pack. There's an alpha couple, and the alpha male and female are the only ones who reproduce, but they all the individuals of the pack take care of the offspring. So that's an example of tactile communication. So they'll play with each other, they'll smell each other and lick each other to show that they have a bond. And bears will scratch and rub up against trees to show that it is their territory. So there's visual because there are scratches in the trees, and then there's also olfactory because they'll leave behind their pheromones. Many forms of communication have evolved to prevent animals from coming to harm in what's called a limited war strategy. So by having a mating dance or by marking territory, the males might not need to fight with each other as much. So if you have less fighting, more individuals of your species will survive. And fighting is very energy intensive. So if you can just mark your territory instead, you are using much less of your energy. There's also advertisement displays, which are behaviors by which individuals draw attention to their status. So, for example, it might be a display such as this, where the male is saying that he is ready to mate. In some species, such as baboons, as the females go through their menstrual cycle, the longer it's been since they menstruated and the more ready they are to ovulate, their butt basically gets redder and darker. And so that's an advertisement to the males in their group that the female is ready to mate and is most likely to become pregnant. So a really cool example of communication is communication in honeybees. So honeybees have a caste system where they have a queen who her sole purpose is to lay eggs. And then there's other individuals such as worker bees who leave the nest to go and find food. So the returning foragers begin a series of movements when they return to the nest in specific patterns. And these movements encode information about the direction of the food and the distance to the food. And there's two different types of dances that these foragers can do. They will do a round dance, and that's when their food is a very short distance, and it's a very simple dance. But if the food is much further away, they will do what is called the waggle dance, which is a much more complicated dance. So we're going to watch a video so you can see exactly what this waggle dance looks like.
Honeybee workers are able to send complex messages to one another. In the wild, they sometimes nest out in the open, but mankind has persuaded them to live and store their honey in hives. The colony's heart is its queen. She is just a little bigger than her subjects and mother of them all. In spring, when food stocks are low, the workers get busy collecting nectar. They have a remarkable method of telling one another where to find the most productive flowers. It's called the waggle dance. This returning bee has just found a new source of nectar and is going to tell others in the hive about it. First, she gathers an audience. To do that, she climbs on her sisters' backs and vibrates her abdomen. Now that she's got their attention, she begins her dance, using a code of movements that tell her fellow workers where her discovery lies. The duration of her waggle indicates the distance to the nectar source. The longer the waggle, the further the flower. And the angle at which she dances across the comb tells them the direction to the flower in relation to the sun. Her instructions are remarkably accurate and can pinpoint the location of a nectar source over 6 kilometers away. Some of her fellow workers set off immediately to find it. In one short season, the colony's workers will visit up to 500 million flowers and will make around 90 kilograms of honey. That is sufficient to sustain the whole colony through the coming winter when there is no nectar to be had.
So even though bees can't talk, they use their movement of their bodies to talk to each other to show where food is located. So we have our third question for today. Which scenario would be considered a type of communication? A, a duckling imprinting on a human, B, a goose rolling an egg back to the nest, C, the plumage of a bird of paradise, or D, a monarch butterfly orienting itself based on the location of the sun. So pause the video and answer this question below. So not all behaviors are done individually. There are social behaviors. Social behaviors occur when organisms are working together. So a group in the same species, typically, but not always, could be different species, work together to achieve a goal. Social behaviors can have a major impact on fitness. It can have an impact on the direct fitness of an individual, and it can have an impact on the indirect fitness of individuals that it's closely related to. So if you think about certain types of behavior, such as cooperation, that's when organisms work together for a common goal, everybody benefits. This is increasing direct fitness, and if the individuals you're working with are closely related to you, it also increases indirect fitness. So having cooperative social behaviors, such as these killer whales working together as a team to hunt this seal, all members of the group are increasing their fitness. Not all social behaviors benefit everybody equally. There are social behaviors that are altruistic, and these are behaviors that benefit another individual at the cost of that actor. So there's two different types of altruistic behaviors. The first is reciprocal altruism, and that's when individuals exchange favors. So that's the, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So one example of that is in vampire bats. If vampire bats do not feed on blood every 2 days, they will die. But they're only successful at finding a blood meal 30% of the time. So if a bat is returning from a successful feed to the roosting spot of their colony, they will often regurgitate blood to unsuccessful bats in their colony, on the expectation that that favor will be returned at a future date. Because this is a boom or bust system of feeding, either you found a blood meal and you drank blood or you did not, this reciprocal altruism ensures that more individuals in the colony survive. So usually they're more closely related to each other. So that has an impact on the direct fitness, because if you don't find a blood meal but somebody else does and they share their meal with you, you are going to be more likely to survive to adulthood and reproduce. But it also helps the indirect fitness of the colony, because by sharing your meal, you're ensuring that the other members also will be able to survive and reproduce. Kin selection is another example of altruistic behaviors. And this is a form of natural selection that favors the spread of alleles that promotes behaviors to help close relatives or kin. So an example of kin selection is in lions and other animals that live in family groups. In lion prides, you have the matriarch of the group, and then the other lionesses are typically her sisters or closely related individuals, and then the young of those females. Whenever the lionesses make a kill, all the members of the family of that pride are able to eat the food. So even though the young are not able to hunt yet because they're not big enough and strong enough and don't have the proper skills, having that social bond ensures that all members of the pride can survive to adulthood. Other animals such as wolves, primates, wild dogs, and some insects have kin selection. Even though altruistic behavior doesn't always benefit the person that is doing that behavior, altruistic behavior may persist because it increases the survival of the group in such a way as to increase the genetic transmission of that behavior. So one example of extreme social behavior is eusociality, and it's an extreme form of altruism in which colonies have overlapping generations in a nest, cooperative care for young, and a clear and consistent division of labor between reproducers, which is, for example, the queen of a honeybee colony, and the non-reproducers, or the workers. And the castes are determination of what you are going to become is determined by external cues from the environment, nutrition, and hormones. So if we see here in this figure, this is determination of ants, whether you become a queen, a soldier, or a worker, and they're all affected by nutrition, environment, and hormones. So if we look at ants, you can inject the ants with different hormones, and injecting the ants with different hormones will stimulate them to become either queens, soldiers, or minor workers. In honeybees, whether a honeybee larva receives royal jelly or not will determine whether she's going to become a worker or a queen bee. And this picture is a picture of a group of soldier ants that has a very derived caste system. So on the top, you have your worker ants, which work to take care of the colony, take care of the larvae, and find food and bring it back to the nest, and also remove waste from the nest. Then you have soldiers, which have very long specialized mandibles that are used for fighting off invaders. And then you have the queen, whose sole purpose is to lay eggs for the colony. So our fourth question for today. Group selection is not typically seen as an evolutionary stable strategy because A, selfish behaviors are more likely to increase individual fitness. B, it cannot explain behaviors for species with solitary individuals. C, average relatedness is very low between individuals in a population. Therefore, individual fitness cannot increase. Or D, it is not possible to genetically inherit selfless behaviors. So pause the video and answer the question below. Okay, one more question for today. In many primate species, individuals in the same group will often groom each other to get rid of ectoparasites and matting in their fur. This behavior is an example of A, kin selection, B, reciprocal altruism, C, communication, or D, mating behavior. So pause the video and answer the fifth question below. All right, so that's the end of our lecture for today, but one more animal behavior from a very charismatic species. Sea otters sometimes hold hands while they're sleeping to keep from floating away from each other. And often a mother and her pup will hold on to each other while they're resting so that they don't drift off from each other or the rest of their group. So that's the end of today's lecture. Post any questions that you have in the discussion board, email me, or attend the Zoom office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3. And don't forget to submit your questions below. Have a great day.